introduction, but we're delighted this month to welcome Paul Abdul Wadud Sutherland, who is in Lincolnshire. Is that right?
Yes. Market Raisin.
I beg your pardon.
Market Raisin.
Market Raisin.
Yeah, about 20 minutes from Lincoln.
Okay. Fantastic. And you're from Ontario originally, is that right?
Canada, Ontario, that's right. Hamilton. Yeah.
Fantastic. Sheikh Abdul Wadud is a poet, and I don't want to do injustice to your career and the works of poetry that you've written. So if you wouldn't mind interesting some few words about yourself for our listeners here, that would be wonderful.
Well, I started writing poetry when I was 17. Long before I became a Muslim. I didn't become a Muslim until 2004. I went through a period of agnosticism, Buddhism, Christianity, before I became a Muslim. And along the way, I was always writing poetry. But it's interesting to me that the year I became a Muslim was the year I also had first two of my most important books published. And I've had a fair number of books published since then, where I had almost no success before then, which, I leave to you to interpret. But I certainly have written a lot of secular poetry, a lot of mystical poetry, as well as essays, short stories. And I've written a novel called Sometimes the Police Are Friendly. I'm looking for a publisher for that, which has got a mystical journey inside it. So there's always a mystical element to my writing. It may be more explicit at times or more implicit at times, but it's there. I'm 74 years old. I was born in Canada in 1947. I'm immigrated to England in 1973. And I've lived here ever since. I was nationalized in about 1985, I think. I married in 2004 as well. And my wife, Afifa, has been a great help with my poetry, especially Islamic poetry, and also other writings.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. I noted that you said that all your writings have always had a mystical element to it. Does that predate your Islam?
Yes.
So you okay?
Yes, I wrote mystical Christian poetry, and from the age of 10, I've had otherworldly experiences, and I've been trying to include them in my writing as a way of understanding and as a way of expressing what is beyond the obvious, what is beyond the empirical.
And how did you, so these mystical experiences that you had, so is that something that happened in your childhood too? You were saying
Yes.
And how did you understand those at such a young age? What did you make of them?
Well, I was at a Christian boys camp, and I don't think anyone there liked me. And we were in this evening service. It was summer, and there was no roof to this chapel. And when everyone bowed their heads down, I kept my head up for some reason. I've always been a rebel. And I just saw the nature in front of us, the hills, the clouds, and everything transformed, translucent, in a matter of seconds. It was a revelation for me. I've never seen anything like it. And I thought, I'll have to go and tell my vicar about this. Because this justifies all his chatter. So I rushed off to tell him, knock, knock. And he only remembered me. I was the boy who didn't like the porridge. So I associated it, the experience, with what I was worshiping, but it was on a higher level than what most people were experiencing or what I've been told about or so on. But he denied it. He wouldn't tolerate it. So I learned two things. I learned that I did have spiritual experiences, and who was I going to share them with? You know, that became quite a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And it also alienated me in some cases further. And I had to come to terms with that. And that sort of helped push me towards trying to express whatever it was I was feeling, whatever, mystical or secular or whatever, imagination, whatever, and I pursued it, Imran. I pursued it. I would go out into the woods, I'd go out into the snow and just watch the moon set or the sun rise. I would sit there for hours just watching, feeling I must become receptive to whatever this is, whatever this mysterious thing is. I have to become receptive to it. I have to make an effort. I can't just depend on it coming to me when it feels like it. I have to go out and meet it, So I worked in a hospital as an intensive care unit, as an orderly. And that was very significant to me, to experience people dying and experience the human condition when people are at its extremities. And that was very touching and inspirational for me. So I did those kind of things. And then I just decided to come to England because my grandparents were born here. And I got on a ship and traveled across the ocean with no intention of coming back to my homeland. And I got off the boat at Tilbury, and I had a rucksack on my back with a pop tent. And I went to the closest woods I could find. The poor man coming in with his dog saw someone in his woods with a tent, and he was quite shocked. And I just started to walk north. I stayed with a few relatives and places and friends, and I just walked north and north till I got to Kendal in the Lake District. And then I met people who were interested in caring for disabled children. I worked for them as a volunteer for about 2.5 years. Mm-hmm. And then disabled adults for about 2.5 years somewhere else in the country. And then I went away to Fair Isle in the North Sea and lived there for 10 months in a hut and wrote and experienced the power of nature, And I eventually came back and I lived in York, and I decided I was going to be a writer. So I went to, I knew I was going to be a writer, but then I thought I better get on with it. And I met people who I could share things with. So that was significant for me.
And in the course of your travels, were you also writing during this period?
Yes, I was. I had journals I was writing. Most of the poetry, I'm sorry, was. I look at it now and I think it's as wooden as old turnips. But you had to go through that. You had to write. As a friend of mine says, write more to write. You write worse to write better. I mean, you got to practice. And that was very much my experience. And on Fair Isle, when I was there in a hut on my own, there were spiritual experiences, definitely.
And what role did the poetry that you now look back on and you describe as wooden? What was your motivation at that time? Was it something that you feel that you needed to express, or were you trying to understand your experiences, or what was?
I was knocked sideways by the remarkable weather and nature of living on an island in the middle of the North Atlantic, and you know, the North Sea on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other. I've always been inspired very much by nature. But underneath that, I realized my life was very turbulent. And I had all kinds of trouble with relationships and so on, and didn't stay with people. And I was trying to come to terms with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I had left my grandparents when I left Canada, I remember very well sitting down at this on this table with these little reeds coming out, and really specifically wanting to write about my grandparents and what they meant to me.
And is that something that you did? Did you?
That's something I did, and I've done it again and again. And the work has got better over the years, I think, inshallah.
And can you describe a little bit about your grandparents, or what it was that caused why they were an inspiration for you to that
Well,
you
my
feel it's something.
grandfather was a Renaissance man to me. He was a poet. He was a fantastic gardener. He was a sculptor. He was a cabinet maker. That's how he earned his living. But I lived at my grandparents' house. My parents were upstairs and my grandparents were downstairs. And till I went to school, I was all the time in his basement, his cellar, where he worked. And he recited poetry to me. Horatio at the Bridge by Macaulay, The Lady of the Lake, Lady of Shalott by Tennyson, which we probably all know, and the Pied Piper of Hamelin. You know, he could recite the whole of the Pied Piper of Hamelin by Robert Browning. And this, you know, all just went in when you're 4.5 years of age. You just absorbed all this. What it did to me, I think, Brother Imran, is that it legitimized spending time to write. That it was a worthwhile occupation.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of them. My grandmother was equally inspiring with her sensitivities. Let's put it that way. Her sensitivities. What you wouldn't react to, what I wouldn't react to, my grandmother would react to. And I was left with this feeling that really I was so deficient as a person because I couldn't understand what my grandmother was reacting to. So she was challenging all the time my limits of perception and saying there's more to perceive, there's more to perceive, there's more to perceive, there's more to understand. And I think that was very valuable to me.
It was interesting as you were describing that. What came to my mind was the idea of poetry in Arabic, and as the Arabic word being shi'r, as you'll be aware, and you know the idea of shi'r coming from the word for feeling and experience. And so when you were saying words about sensitivity and perception, it instantly just reminded me of the Arabic for it. And so that's really profound. It's really interesting.
Well, I think my grandparents instilled in me that there was a possibility of being profound, that you could not necessarily live on one level. And as my life went on and I had spiritual experiences of a Christian nature, I realized this depth existed. And I tried to be receptive to it through practice. When I became a Muslim, I was looking for a holy person. I'd been looking for a holy person all through my life. And when I met my wife-to-be, Afifa Amatollah, she said, "You've always been a Sufi," because she read this book of mine called The Seven Earth Odes, a little book that I got published in 2004. It's now part of the New and Selected Poems. And she just said, "You've always been a Sufi." And from her coming into my life, Sheikh Nazim Al-Haqqani, Allah bless his soul, came into my heart. So I think in a way, I was a little bit prepared for this because my grandparents had convinced me you could be more profound. You could experience things on another level if you made the effort. And I think that was preparation for becoming a Sufi, becoming attached to Sheikh Nazim.
Could you speak could you tell us in your experience or perhaps even an introduction for our listeners who aren't aware of Sheikh Nazim?
Well, I'm a member of the Naqshbandi Tariqat, which is a Sufi order that goes back many centuries. It's very, I mean, my wife to be had been a Sufi from 1980. I met her in 2004. So she was well steeped in the practice. And what I'm trying to say is that, I mean, I was very fortunate, I think. I doubt I would have become a Muslim through any other route than through an inner route. Once I was aware that this sheikh was in my heart. And I know to give you an example of it, I was seeing a counselor at the time because, like I say, my life was generally in turmoil. And she said to me, "You don't need to come anymore," which was a bit of a challenge because I thought, oh, I've offended another woman. She said, "No, you've got a presence beside you." Now, this counselor never came across to me as having any interest in spiritual matters, but she was able to see this presence beside me, and I believe that was Sheikh Nazim. And my life just changed at that point. And I began to feel I had to try to express this, as I have done everything else in my life. I had to try to express this. So I've known there were good people in the world, and I met many through Christianity. But I believed, because of my experiences, my mystical experiences, there was something else. And that's spiritual power. And that's the ability to alter things through your prayers, through contemplation, through repetitive practice. And the biggest thing to change, of course, is yourself. Mm-hmm. That's the real masterpiece, is changing yourself. And the Sheikh and all the Sufi orders are an attempt to move you from your animal nature to your human nature, to ideally an angelic nature. And you're in that process somewhere. I think everyone who becomes a Muslim must feel that something fundamental has changed in them, and they want to live up to certain values, certain ideals. I think that's very evident in the many converts. There's many converts in the Naqshbandi order, Western converts. And, you know, but unfortunately, of course, I'm still a Westerner, and I've been influenced by that. And there's only so much you can overcome. As it says, you know, we pray that Allah will overcome things that only He can overcome for us. So I don't know, maybe you ask some more questions, a little more particular questions, I'll be able to. He asked, a question down here is asking, do I ever experience a writer's block? Well, that's a good question. I haven't until recently. I said I went to Uzbekistan on this pilgrimage or Syriat, and I may mispronounce it. I'm sorry, my pronunciation of Arabic is not great. And afterwards, I was sick. So sick, I couldn't write. And that has not happened for a long, long time. But I didn't really feel that distraught about it, because if everything is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is the highest adab to accept that, then you have to accept that not everything that he sends is positive to you. You have to perceive that negative things will happen with a positive result. And that is what I encountered. I thought, okay, I can't write now, so maybe I'll write afterwards. So if you're in a writer's block, my friend, just try to absorb everything around you, observe, 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 and slowly I think you'll come out of it. It's probably a blessing at times to be in a writer's block or in some situation that isn't serving us, so that we realize and keep holding on to our humility, that this universe is far bigger than us.
Could I zoom out a little bit at this stage and discuss the nature of poetry and how it sits in kind of modern culture? I'm sure in days gone by, poetry, English poetry, was more commonplace. It wasn't necessarily restricted to a particular class or a particular, this is even like a level of education. Whereas, you know, if we compare poetry in the Islamic world and, you know, Islamic history, it's been something that's transcended all of these different ways of, you know, categorizing society or whatnot. But in at least English poetry, my experience is that it's the role of poetry. It's been associated with a certain particular, like I said, like a certain particular class, maybe a certain particular education. And why do you think that is? If you agree with that observation, or if you have a different observation, I'd be very interested to hear it.
Well, the more I read English poetry, the more I realize that many people wrote it or dictated it of different classes, but they didn't receive the same recognition as upper class writers. Publishing was expensive, but gradually, you know, the feminist historians are uncovering poets from way back, time of Shakespeare and the earlier female poets that just never got any recognition, but they were there. And the same with the anonymous poets. The anonymous ballads were not probably written by elite people, or nursery rhymes who had secret meanings were coded, because of course you could lose your head for saying certain things in public. But decoding all this is a major task, of course. But it means that lots of people were writing or speaking poetry that was passed on orally that we don't know about, that isn't in our fundamental education. That's one of the problems, is just how deeply does ordinary comprehensive education go in trying to get us to understand the diversity and breadth of these poetic expressions. there's many poems out there. You read Opie, the Opie husband and wife who collected an Oxford dictionary of poetry, children's poetry, written by all kinds of people. And what's happened, I think, gradually, is over the 20th century, these places have been recognized now. Gradually, the different classes have been recognized, and the different voices. So we have a much more diverse poetry, I think, than we did have in the 19th century, for example. And it's even becoming more diverse as, in fact, many ethnic groups in the country, dare I say, Canadians, or Sufis, you know, are beginning to get some kind of recognition through the Poetry Book Society, through the Poetry Society. If you look at what's being published, you think it's a really broad spectrum of poetic expression. And I can't see it becoming less. So I think, you know, there's been different movements. There's been the Black movement as well in the United States, which definitely has had knock-on effects in this country, which Islam benefited from. And Islam benefits from things that are to do with Asia, for example. Or there's, you know, there's a beautiful collection of poetry out by Lotte Press called Kaleidoscope of Stories. And it's got a vast range of poetry about Islam by English writers. And I know it doesn't have the recognition it should have, but it's there. And yes. And so I think I agree with you. I agree with you, but I think it's also changed. I think it's, you know, there was a time you go to the library and you look on the shelf, poetry, and it'd be all male writers. Well, that's not the case anymore. Or all university writers. It's not the case anymore. Or all, you know, English writers. I mean, people who are British, born in Britain. In fact, I think now you have a better chance of being published if you're slightly off center.
Yeah.
I think it's amazing how it's changed.
And I guess on the issue of kind of Islamic poetry in English, we can't I guess we can't ignore the rise and the popularity of Rumi, you know, as the world's best-selling author now in so many different markets. So
why did that happen? You know, why? You know, all is clever. You know, he knew he wanted Islam to come to the West. So he allowed someone like Edward Fitzgerald to translate Persian poetry, to create the Rubaiyat. The Rubaiyat was just a sequence of little sheets of paper in hidden in a big library in Oxford. And this man called Cofield said to Edward Fitzgerald, "Would you like to translate this?" And he said, "Okay." So he translated about 24 poems to start with, and by 1869 or something, he had been translating about 100 of them. No one paid any attention to him until Tennyson dedicated a poem to him called "To Fritz." And people said, "Who's Fritz?" Now that book, the Rubaiyat, when Cofield, as a Christian, saw what Edward Fitzgerald had written, he was horrified, because this was not Christianity. This was something else. And that book became so popular. And now we have the effect of Rumi, you know? So many people may be reading Rumi, but we also have Mohammed Saleh running up and down the field at Liverpool. You know, how did he did? He's another spokesperson for Islam, isn't he?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's just amazing how these things happen. Here's the crop. You know, the crop isn't going to be interested. These Liverpool supporters are not going to be interested in Rumi. But you put a Muslim on the floor, on the field, who scores remarkable goals. And the impact of this is unbelievable. So, you know, it's amazing just how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the most unexpected ways to bring Islam to the West. And Rumi is certainly one of them. Now, a lot of people have mistranslated it or over-translated it. I've read many, you know, almost, well, Rumi and Shams Duplessis were actually in a homosexual relationship. I'm sorry, I don't believe that one. But they're still reading it. That's the point, isn't it? Mm-hmm. They may not even understand half of what they're reading. They may misunderstand. But their subconsciousness is taking in what they would have rejected. And this is the same with the crop in Liverpool. They are having to take in what they would have rejected. And Rumi is a great example, yeah. But then there's Rumi and there's Sadi and there's Hafiz, and, you know, it's wonderful to find out what's behind Rumi as well. What, you know, Yunus Emery is very interesting. And on YouTube, there is from Turkey, there's these different programs, and that's well watched, about Yunus Emery, a Sufi poet. Mm-hmm. So again, somehow, even though we're frightened, you know, frightened as Muslims, because you just don't want a car is going to drive on the pavement and try to run you over. And it's real. At the same time, good things are happening. Remarkable things are happening. Mm-hmm. And acceptance is happening. You know, even through COVID, there's another thing. You know, COVID, what is it doing in terms of Islam in this country? It has made people focus way away from, you know, Al-Qaeda and the terrorists and everything. They haven't focused on them. And then 20,000 Afghanistans arrive in the country. And 99.9% of them are going to be Muslim. It's like, you know, we don't want Islam in England, no. They just can't, you know, they just can't stop it. That's the point, isn't it? It's just way out of reach of anyone stopping it. And I find that fascinating. Someone's got to write the book of how we've gone from 3 or 4 mosques in 1960s to 500 in inside London. You know, someone's got to write that book. That is a greater expansion than the Cistercians in the Middle Ages or the building of monasteries. It's it's a transformation. It's a revolution, you know.
And on that particular note, you know, that's often cited as a reason why people feel threatened. Like people see these mosques and they feel threatened because they see something of what their country or their identity being threatened. What do you think is going on there?
Well, people are threatened and people do die. You know, I mean, it's not an illusion. and it's ironic. Anyone who isn't a Muslim, it's ironic that the biggest threat comes from Muslims. The Islamic State killed more Muslims than it killed Christians and so on. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Pakistan had spent, you know, I don't know, 6,000 soldiers trying to control the extremists in that country. What are extremists? I've written about this in an essay called The Muslim Dilemma, because in a way, to try to understand this, I think we have to go back to colonialism and see how oppressed these countries were. And out of that is possibly going to come a violent reaction. And I think it'll take time before, we can really absorb being oppressed for so long by colonialism. And of course, as we see, even in the invasion of Iraq, it's just going to take time for us to absorb this and kind of stop saying they're the enemy, and so on. I'm going to be quite interested to see how the Taliban handle being in government, because I can't think of another jihadist group that's ever been in government. And I wonder if that's going to change them a little bit, modify their attitudes. I don't know. But as a Sufi, we feel again that our sheikh is our guide, and it's important to not lose your protection or your well-being through being over engaged with these political movements or fears, of threats, which come through a politicalization of religion, don't they? I mean, you have good Hindus and you have Hindus that want to kill you. And when you're in India, you feel it. I've been there 3 times since 2014, and every time I went back, it was more and more threatening. This country is much, much better than India, right now. And I think it's important that we understand that, we understand the advantages of our country, and appreciate what we have, at the same time trying to promote our faith. And not to lose faith. That's that's part of the challenge, not to lose faith when you see these bad things happening to Muslims.
Sorry, I saw a question come from Sheikh Bilal there.
I didn't see
and the
that.
question. So his question was, have you ever received any negative or any opposition from the Muslim community, particularly with regard to your poetry?
Yes, I have, because you put your head above the parapet, as they say, and I went down to Cambridge Muslim College, and it's on YouTube, and I read from my book, Servant of the Loving One, published by Beacon Press. And I had a conversation with Sheikh, Abdul Hakim Murad there, and I got some negative comments made on YouTube. I tell myself the best comment was, it's an abomination. Because there are people who feel that the mysticism of Sufism is anti the strictness of Islam. And it's a conflict that's gone on for probably 1,500 years. So why are we surprised it's still happening, So, I mean, I didn't get any death threats. I didn't get anything like that. Just, I felt a little bit hurt, but I don't really feel threatened by it.
And your poetry, just to circle back to something that we were discussing earlier, the poetry that you write now, what does that mean to you, and what role does that play compared to how it did when you were younger, before you Islam, before you knew what to make of these experiences?
Well, all the time I've been reading poetry and books and going to events, and I was the chief editor at a literary magazine called Dreamcatcher, which I started. And in each of those stages, I learned. And I feel like now I'm trying to apply what I learned, which is also related to Islam.
Mm-hmm.
I've written a book called Poems on the Life of the Prophet Muhammad in 2012. And I don't think I could write that book now. And I think this is one of the things that's hard to accept, that inspiration comes and goes. That is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he doesn't have to be always giving it to you. But you're not supposed to crash out because that happens. So I see it very much as now it's still my main way of expressing my feelings. So I write a novel, like I said, or short stories or essays. And I see it as a big part of my life. My intimate relationship, my faith, and my poetry as being as important. And also when we went up to Uzbekistan, I tried to express the faith through the poetry and accept that.
Mm-hmm.
But as new challenges arise through experiences, like I lost my granddaughter in 2012, became estranged from her. And so all children's issues have stung me, if you like, and made me write about them and research them and write about them. The fate of children in family courts, the fate of children as refugees, wandering around Europe, 95,000, says UNICEF. So then this happens. I don't exactly know how, but it happens. And that becomes a focus for me to write about these things, these experiences and these people. How do you represent people? You know, that's been my biggest kind of challenge, is if you're going to write, you're writing about people, how are you going to represent them? Cautiously, compassionately, and not fall into stereotypes. So I feel that process has gone on, and I'm harder on myself, what I write.
And do you feel that your poetry is, do you feel a responsibility to write?
Absolutely. Because now I have an audience out there. I feel responsible now. Here, look, these people are listening to me. And part of that is, okay, over the years, I guess I have gained some kind of reputation, willingly or unwillingly. And I do feel a responsibility. I always have, to be honest, but it's grown somehow. And I think Islam's got a role in that, because it somehow pushed me along. Like this book here has sold over 1,000 copies. So we're in our second 1,000, and with the YouTube video, we have 34,000 people who have visited that site. Now that doesn't happen normally in poetry. And it wouldn't happen to me unless I was a Muslim. So there is responsibility involved.
I was interested in something you said just towards the beginning of the answer. You said that you've always felt this responsibility. So even prior to you having the audience that you now have, what responsibility? What did that look like? What responsibility did you feel, and who did you feel that towards?
Yeah, that's a great question. Great question. Because there was times when I spent in my bed and my bed sit in York 48 hours a weekend just writing, I mean, writing and writing for 10 hours, 12 hours, just writing, and still felt responsible what I was writing. So who was I responsible for? Because no one's ever, well, very few people have seen. And yet I think that is quite common with writers, that they have long periods or some length of period where again, we're going back to that writer's block, where you just write and write and write. And it's not, what I guess it is really is a sense of cosmic responsibility. You're not just talking about a people, but you're talking about the cosmos as an actual reality, an entity that you're trying to express. And you feel a certain responsibility towards the cosmos, or maybe you feel it towards previous writers, like Rumi. You read Rumi and you start writing, you think, okay, well, is this how would he respond to this? Maybe you feel that subconsciously. And it's a very good question. It's very hard to pin down what I felt at that time. I was becoming very political and aware of the underprivileged in the world. And I felt some kind of mission to express for them, to speak against the kind of dominance of which we're experiencing now very much, this kind of belief that it's strange, isn't it, how the government kind of wants everyone to believe they're right. That's what governments want, isn't it? We're right, even when we're wrong. But the radical voice is, you've got to be right. If you're not right, you're wrong. So that I was becoming radicalized politically. And I just felt more and more responsibility towards trying to get that message across. And eventually, I did find people who were willing to listen to me. Isn't it interesting, if you know the story of, some of the great sheikhs that have come to this country, Qibla Alam is one of them, of the Naqshbandi as-Salam. And for years and years, no one visited him. He worked in a factory. No one came. He did his prayers over and over again, and then someone came eventually. And that's faith, isn't it? Just to carry on. And I think I had some of that. And it's almost like synonymous with faith is a sense of responsibility. How can you separate them?
Mm-hmm. For sure. And at the echelon, at the peak, you have the prophets, and right, and you have the saints and the godly people who shoulder this responsibility and feel and give of themselves and of their time and whatnot out of responsibility, I'm sure.
Yes, and that's what I discovered with coming to the Naqshbandi and having bayat with a sheikh, that he takes you as his responsibility. He's trying to help you, and he takes responsibility for you. He doesn't make it, he doesn't carry you. Well, maybe he does. You still have to work. I guess being a writer, I mean, you have to work. And I remember one of the descriptions of poetry is memorable speech. Well, it's hard to make words memorable speech. So that work is always there.
That was going to be my next question, actually. Well, the question from our brother Liam, who asked a while ago, which actually would have been a great place to start, is how do you how do you define poetry? What is poetry?
Well, that's been an issue for centuries. A famous poet like Shelley, Percy Shelley, who wrote To a Skylark, Woe to the West Wind, he said there's no such thing as poetry. There is only measured and unmeasured words, language. There's either a language that's measured by beat, rhythms, rhyming, various devices, or it's not. Well, I think that's become a big issue over the centuries, and now in the 21st century, you can see a lot of prose poems, they call them, and miniatures. I write a lot of miniatures, haiku, this sort of. So what is poetry? This again, if we had brought up in the middle of the 18th century, we would have in England, we'd have a very different idea of what is poetry. There still are people who think poetry has to rhyme. But it's, the more you read in a breadth, read in translation, it challenges what you mean by poetry. I come down to it being, let's put it this way. I know when something is pretty good, when it has a certain poetic feel to it and flow, rhythm. Famous poet called Michael Longley said poetry, if it doesn't have rhythm, it has nothing. So there you are. It's got to have some kind of musicality. So there again is your measured language. And I think that's what we should strive for, is measured language. Read out loud. Look for startling images. And try to connect them. If you're going to create something, you want it to have some kind of connection with each part of it. So maybe, if you use a metaphor like the river, you might in another part of the poem write about the pebbles on the bottom of the river, or the fish, or a bridge over the river. You try to connect things. And by connecting things, you get to another level slowly. And I have noticed that. So maybe, you see, on the one hand, you can say everything that's measured is poetry. On the other, as a poet, you can feel very, very hard on yourself, saying, no, that's not what I want. So you have this little bit of conflict, that you're striving for something, striving for some kind of better way of writing. You know how the Beatles said, take a sad song and make it better? Mm-hmm. Well, really, that's the fundamental of it. Make it better. And you have all these different devices to do so. And certainly one of them can be worship and prayer. Not that you're saying pray all and make my poem better. I mean, I wouldn't put it past someone to say that, and it might be fine to say it. But just the practice of being meditative, of being inward. And then when this happens, I'm praying and a poem comes to me and just says, that line you had there is rubbish, get rid of it, So it doesn't answer the question, but there isn't really an answer to the question. Mm. It's like, certain things are unpresentable. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is unpresentable. And you're striving for something that's sublime, but perhaps only you know it. And other people either attach themselves and like it or don't. But maybe only you know if you have actually overcome something and that it's now better.
So if So you do workshops, I believe, and you teach.
I have done quite a few workshops over my freelance career. Yes.
So if someone who considers themselves a non-poet, someone who isn't necessarily been exposed to it that much and doesn't feel they're almost worthy of writing poetry, what's your advice to someone like that?
Well, right. It's good to go to a workshop and be inspired by a poet, you know. And they will help you. And they will show you that your language is yours. It's unique. And that you can develop it. That you can mold it like clay. That you can draw things up from the subconscious that you would not normally write about or think about. But in the process of writing, sometimes, one time I wrote for about 5 pages before I came to a poem where I was playing football, Canadian football, American football, with an American who was going off to Vietnam. I completely buried this experience, but it just came to the surface. They're very important when the subconscious comes to the surface and tells you something that's completely alien to what you were thinking, to what you were contriving, to what your conscious mind was doing. But you have to make time for that to happen, or you're inspired for it to happen. So going to a workshop, I think you can also feel the fellowship of the group and that other people are equally striving to try to express themselves, express what they feel is valuable. And I think it's quite beneficial because you will come away feeling that you have something worth saying and that you have a unique language and that you can speak with it and write with it. I mean, it's where in many ways I began, which of course was lucky when my grandfather was citing to me. But it was just the shock of revelation, you know, like following a butterfly and having the courage to follow a butterfly and just taking those kind of intuitive steps. And women are very good at listening to their intuition mostly, and I think men should learn to listen to their intuition. And because all the time we're thinking things and we're kind of overriding what we think, what we feel. A poet has to stop that process and let what they're feeling or thinking rise up for them to examine it, for them to look at it, say, can I write about this? Is this interesting? And this would be my advice. Go to a workshop, share, be guided, and then this is external work, and then do the internal work. Spend the hour, 2 hours a day just writing or just reading poetry. Make that effort, outward and inward. What people can see and what they can't see. And you will create things.
Thank you. That's a wonderful, a very practical answer. We had a question. Okay, this might open a open a can of worms, so feel free to answer this in whatever level of detail you choose. The question was, if you were, let me get the question again. Bismillah. If you were to put your conversion down to one event, what would it be?
Well, it's a good question. I've never analyzed my conversion or reversion down to one really crucial event. It always seems to me it's like a macros, where things come together, they meet a critical mass, and it kind of explodes. And you're on the other side of whatever you were before. I think the most significant was the input of Sheikh Nazim Al-Haqqani. I think that was the most significant, though my wife played a very, very important role in guiding me towards acceptance and being ready to be receptive to this power. But I think Sheikh Nazim is probably, Allah bless his soul, the most influential factor, because it was such an experience to have this reality inside you suddenly.
Jazakallah khair. I think that's it for the questions. I'm conscious of the time. I apologize to everyone for the slightly delayed start. We've now been going over an hour. I'm sure there's many of the questions and many of the things we can discuss about. But I hope we're blessed with your presence and at the time. And I want to say a huge thank you for giving us this time and sharing for a small part of your incredible story.
Well, thank you. And can I just ask you to put the information about these books on your website or wherever wherever other people here, they might be interested in looking at them or even purchasing them. And of course, to support Beacon Press, Jamil Chisti.
Yeah,
Beacon Press.
He's a friend of ours.
Yeah, support him.
Reading list.
Yeah. So we have a section on our website, Sheikh Abdul Wadud. We have a section of recommended reading. So we'll add your books to the poetry section,
Okay.
and we'll share it with the New Beginnings Telegram room, which is our kind of primary mode of
so you, it's like a newsletter? You have a kind of newsletter?
We do have a mailing. Yeah, we do have a mailing list. We also have a Telegram room, which is basically like WhatsApp. So we've got 100, 150 people in there.
Well, I
basically
think
anyone.
It'd be good if you could, to put that, to put the books on your Telegram would be very helpful.
Yeah, inshallah, we will do. We'll also be sharing, with your permission, we'll be sharing this lecture on YouTube too, and we'll also be sharing it, of course, with our community, because I think it would be a wonderful introduction for people who aren't familiar with you to hear a bit about your story, and hopefully with a view to engaging with some of your works, inshallah. A huge thank you once again on behalf of myself and New Beginnings, the organization and the wonderful community that we have here. It's been an incredible, very, very profound experience to just hear your journey. And so interesting. I'm sure there's so many more things that we could have spoken about, but I do hope, inshallah, the future we can discuss more things and perhaps have you on again at some point.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I hope I've said some interesting things, inshallah. I'm willing. Only through Allah does anything. There's no virtue in me. It comes through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have to empty ourselves. This is a big deal. Emptying ourselves and trying to be more and more receptive to what comes in purity, what comes untainted from the sheikhs, from the holy ones that have been sent here to help us. And Muhammad, I think he said that, that no generation or culture will be without these holy ones.
May Allah allow us to love them and to find them if we can't be them ourselves, inshallah. Could I request you to conclude the session with a short dua, a short prayer?
Alhamdulillah. Well, forgive me, but I'm going to depend on my words. A song for the end. If I must lie down under the stars, rest my turban on my camel's neck, let it be between sweet Ji'il and Idita. Then I may fall asleep for 1,000 years, not wake till the land's greened over with mercy. If I must be indoors to keep the fierce wind out, let it be under a roof of Itater, where all the cavities are fragrant with Ji'il. Then a love-sent breeze may take me beyond wars of this world to a palace of unbroken peace. If I must lose my footing in the desert, then let it be among these delicate grasses. I may have no water, yet the sun may not burn. I may lose everything but the love of Muhammad. Angels send blessings and peace upon him. If I must fall ill, waste away from fever, let it be among the softness of Ji'il and Itater. Then if I twist my body to Mecca or Medina, east or west, the spirit of Muhammad will guide me. All his blessings and peace be upon him. Al-Fatiha. Ameen.
Ameen. Jazakallah khair. Allah bless you. Thank you once again. And thank you everyone for joining. And we'll have the recording up hopefully soon. And we'll be sharing a list of your works with our community, along with your newest book is New and Selected Poems. I understand, yeah.
Well, the newest one is Servant of the Loving One, but I would like you to have the new and selected poems on the list. It's from Valley Press.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you want me to send you a list, just send me your email, and I got your email. So if you need a list, I can send them to you.
Fantastic. Yeah, that would be brilliant. And we can forward that directly to the to our mailing list.
Okay. So salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.